So, Shao Loong, let's talk a little bit more about your take from Xi Jinping, especially after both leaders, the Prime Minister Ibrahim as well as Xi Jinping, gave what I would say quite remarkable speeches in a good way. They used terms like enduring friendship, long-lasting partnership, an engagement that is not about 50 years of diplomacy between Malaysia and China, but more of 1,000 years of civilization discussing with each other how best to shape this part of the world. Do you see these kind of conversations as, I would say, promising, or more importantly, cautiously optimistic about what is going to be for the next maybe 3 to 5 years ahead of us?
I think China, we have to recognize that China is the superpower in our very own backyard. Or looking at the other way, we're in China's backyard. The US is the other superpower, but it's on the other side of the Pacific from us, right? And we have relationships with both. But I think China has also given a deep recognition that Malaysia was the first country within ASEAN to open up a diplomatic channel with it, in the wake of the, Second World War and the détente with the US. And I think that length of that kind of high-quality relationship has been remembered. And I think Xi Jinping wrote a very generous letter, open letter to Malaysia ahead of his visit. I don't know whether you read it, but he really is like a history, textbook of all the goings-on between Malaysia and China over decades and centuries, as you mentioned. So I think going ahead now, of course, economic ties between Malaysia and China are only going to deepen. We've signed, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP, in recent years. That's building upon the ASEAN plus China agreement. Now I think there's discussion about having ASEAN plus China revisited again in terms of trade agreements. Of course, our global value chain, we're very much tied up in China, more so than the US. But of course, the goods end up flowing to the US as well. And this is where some of the complications come in.
I would like to approach this on two angles. The first is on the cultural aspect. How are we going to see ourselves as Asian-centric? Tun Mahathir many years ago did ask us to pivot, look East policy. That's one area, cultural. Another area is industries, because especially as you rightfully pointed out before the start of the interview, sectors like the E&E, for instance, or semicon, very much geared towards how the US is going to shape our industries in this side of the world, especially in the realm of fabrication and of course manufacturing, not so much the design yet. Now, considering that China and US are our two biggest trade partners other than that of Singapore, do you feel that because of the volatility that the White House brings today, more so than Trump's first term, it's just going to be a reality that we're going to depart dealing with American companies and America altogether? Or do you feel that this is just another one of those hiccups, just 4 years, we're going to get back to business after Trump? How do you see these two elements?
Okay, this is a big crystal ball question. And I think one of the ways to cut it is to look at the fact that, okay, Trump is going to be there for at least 4 years, right?
Okay, so because,
I say at least, advisedly.
Yeah, he said that he wants to do another term and the Constitution doesn't allow it, and he says, why not just change the Constitution? So there's that.
There's a debate about that, right? So that's why I say at least 4 years.
Yeah.
But then, even if it's not him, it could well be an ideological heir, right? You've got the likes of J.D. Vance, who, pretty much is the, he is the kind of more hardline ideological cheerleader for MAGA, make America great again. And he's kind of set out his thoughts extensively in writing, and he's very articulate about it. So there's every possibility that at some point, maybe he's next, or maybe in another round or two, he could also be a presidential candidate, and you could see similar policies being brought online. So what we have to look at is not just the short term with the US. We have to look at the long term, right? And I think it's a good education for Malaysia, because you've got, say, Chinese policy on the one hand, they're very long term, right? They don't do anything without having done a lot of planning and research. They didn't pivot away from coal without doing tons of research at the Chinese Academy of Sciences. It's been a kind of 20 or 30 year kind of project there. Then the US does shift quite a lot, and we've seen policy shift dramatically towards Asia through many presidents, right? From Obama down to Trump, then Biden, then back to Trump again. And the last time we heard America talk about centuries was the Project for the New American Century under the neocons, right? And that was about 20 years ago under George W. Bush. So far they haven't really been talking in that kind of long-term time frame. But I think it's a good reminder for us as well. And you were talking about history earlier. I mean, one of the things to remember, there's this great book by a scholar from my old university called Janet Abulugod, and she wrote Before European Hegemony. And she basically described the Indian Ocean economy before the arrival of the Europeans, right? And that was basically an economy where, the center was Southeast Asia, and then you had China, you had India, the Middle East, and so forth, right? And the trade flowed back and forth. This is the monsoon trade, right? Where we were the kind of crossing point. And there were two things that disrupted it. First, the Mongols invaded from Central Asia. They knocked out both the Chinese and the Indian empires. Then the Europeans took over the trade routes, right? And then that became the kind of modern world as we know it, right? But in a way, what we see now, the potential for it, we see out of these new Asian connections, the rise of India, rise of China, rise of ASEAN as well, is a kind of rebuilding of that old Indian Ocean kind of trading network. Right? And we're kind of re-establishing these relationships. This is a time when Malays were very involved in ocean commerce, right? Before the British kind of forced them out. As Syed Hussein Alatas is covered in Myth of the Lazy Native. So, in a way, I think we do have to revisit some of these lessons from the past in order to help inform our future. But we really need to start thinking strategically long-term to manage the emerging risks, right? And these risks, why are they coming about? In a way, I look at international relations, realist theory, and that's going to tell us that a country like the US, it's become the superpower. It beat Europe. It beat rivals from Europe, such as Germany, and it prevented the rise of Germany through entering into World War II. And then it beat down Japan in Asia, and it became the dominant power in its own hemisphere, right, the Western Hemisphere. And one of the lessons from that, as the US international relations scholar John Mearsheimer says, is that a superpower like that, a great power, can't tolerate the rise of another great power.
Yeah.
Right?
Well,
And
like
inevitably,
a Highlander thing, there can only
there
be
can
one.
only be one, right? And it can't tolerate one emerging and dominating in another region for fear that it will begin to dominate its own region, right? So there's this kind of fear of someone interfering with your backyard. I would say that's the kind of guiding theory under, say, the Obama and the Biden administrations. With Trump 2.0 now, we see a bit of a shift in that. There is a rivalry with China, but that rivalry is primarily economic. But they seem to want to just focus on the Western Hemisphere. That's why he's talking about Greenland, and Canada, rewriting the relationship with Mexico, the Panama Canal. It's very much what is the alternate theory of international relations called spheres of influence. We just want to jug our own backyard, right? And they're less concerned about interfering with Taiwan. In fact, they want to kind of de-risk from Taiwan, which I'm sure is good news for China, right? Whereas, you see the Democrats, they're all in about using Taiwan as a kind of a, geopolitical kind of chess piece.
Yeah,
right?
as a shield towards the access to the Pacific Ocean, more likely.
So that has economic consequences, for countries like ours as well. So when MAGA begins to kind of turn inward and domestically, and they're very, to be fair to them, people like Vance and so forth, they're very concerned about the deterioration of the American heartland, right? The loss of manufacturing, which they see as this kind of quest to regain. That's why we had the tariffs and all this kind of stuff. Whether they can actually pull it off with these current policies and the way in which they're engaging in what you could loosely call negotiation, is the question at hand.
Being generous with that term with them.
Yes.
But okay, yeah. But let's look at it this way, right? Professor Roger Lehman of INSEAD and MIT Sloan, he argued that what America is doing is not necessarily short-termism. In fact, he argues that they are disassembling how they want to approach global trade. And it is a groupthink, considering that Republicans are in domination of all the three branches of the government. They make no attempts in terms of how to calm waters, and they, in fact, as you would said so just now, de-risking all the kind of geopolitical elements that are happening everywhere. So retreating inwardly, precipitating the whole resurgence of Asia again, and if we draw back or pull back the historical timeline to 1,000 years ago, the two big economies have always been India and China. Now, with the US retreating, and with India and China in a lot of ways getting their act together again, and new actors in play, folks like Indonesia, we don't know the wild card that they've been having for the longest of time, when they're going to play that card, if they get their act together. Do you feel that the posturing of the Madani government is on the right path? I wouldn't say supplicating, but of course opening the doors and allowing for greater negotiations to take place. The Ministry of Economy, for instance, is having great conversations with ARM, the semiconductor company, to have greater IP access for Malaysian companies to have designing chips, for instance. We're looking at MITI allowing for more trade to happen in Africa and South America as well. Are these the right things to do, considering that on the backdrop of this, we have that America that we know of today?
I think the government has taken a lesson since the first Trump administration, say back in 2017, 2018, where there was the start of the US-China trade war, right, so to speak. And there was this opportunity about shifting the balance of economic power, right? And Malaysia, I would say, actively took steps to try and get advantages from that. First courting investment moving out of China that was looking to de-risk and still maintain linkages with the US. And that very much reflects, Malaysia's kind of core position that we want to look both ways, provided that, there is a possibility for a fair and mutually advantageous relationship, right? The current situation has made that more challenging. We've had a good dialogue with China, and I think it's been great for both countries, for the president of China to come to Malaysia as while it's chair of ASEAN. And it's the first time, I think, in 11 years that he's been back here. And I think it's given a great recognition to Malaysia's leadership role. Malaysia's also in recent years tried to diversify its geopolitical and geoeconomic relationships by engaging with BRICS, becoming a BRICS partner country, and that was also welcomed by Xi Jinping in the last week. And we've seen a very close relationship emerge with Brazil as well, including Brazil's presidency of the G20 last year, where I think Malaysia, for the first time, was invited to join the sort of big boys club, right? So it's been a great kind of diplomatic moment for Malaysia, and on top of that,
G20 and BRICS.
Yeah, and and Brazil actually has opened up communication with Malaysia for us to help them in their semiconductor industry as well. So we're doing joint design. I attended a conference last week on the subject. So it's we're deepening these kinds of economic relations with these new large emerging markets, right? And in a way, it's going to help us because we need to de-risk. Everybody needs to de-risk. Even the European Union needs to hedge its risks between the US and China, because when the two greatest markets and producers of the world economy are in conflict, everybody has to think about safety options, right? Of course, there are practical limits to that in the short term, because there's no other market that can absorb as much demand as the US can, right? And Europe is worried about too many Chinese goods flowing in. We've sometimes had challenges with that as well, as the US has closed its borders. Now, I think it's important to have a conversation about managing that relationship, managing, say, the diversion of trade from the US. But I think we need to step it up and also talk about very strategic investments in advanced manufacturing. Because our own semiconductor industry, for example, wants to level up. That's part of the National Semiconductor Strategy. That's under MITI that the Prime Minister himself has been promoting as well since last year.
Let's talk about things that both your colleague at KRI, Dr. Jomo, has been saying about Global South, and Xi Jinping's statement saying that we need to reinvigorate and deepen our relationship in the South-South relationship. What's your view on this, considering that most of the supply chain raw material elements are in Asia and in the Global South area? Advanced manufacturing, you touched it briefly just now, but do you feel that this is the time for us to be serious about G20 about BRICS, about Global South, and other cooperations that we may have not been looking at seriously before, perhaps due to our overdependence to the 3 or 2 big markets or trading partners that we have. Is this the time for us to, in the process of de-risking, move towards a greater cooperation between the Global South right now?
Yes, partly because the time is right, because there are a growing number of emerging market, rising middle income countries coming from the Global South, both from Latin America as well as Africa and Central Asia. That's a lot of choices as it is. Plus the fact that the geopolitical conflicts are also forcing our hand, right? Now, we have to be realistic about it, because to invest in the Global South as major trading partners is really to invest in them as trading partners of the future. Right? We have to lay the seeds now for a 10 to 20 year payoff, right? But it will pay off. Because I think this conflict between the US and China is structural. It's deeply structural, right? It's the nature of realist international relations that they are coming to conflict, primarily because China has been successful at the manufacturing game. It's been successful at reindustrialization. I say reindustrialization because China used to be around 24-25% of the global economy's manufacturing capacity back in a couple of centuries ago. They lost it, and now they're back again, right? In a way, that's what the US wants to try to do for itself, right? But in a way, rather than trying to learn from China, they're just trying to butt heads with them. I think there's lessons there. They're very important lessons for us, but we're a small country, right? We don't have the scale of either the US or China, so we kind of have to do it in a different way. But we have, great competencies, great skills in a number of areas of industrialization, technology, semiconductors, agriculture, and so forth. And we've also built very good institutions for accumulating and managing wealth, right? Our oil and gas wealth has been channeled into sovereign wealth funds like Kumpulan Wang Amanah Negara. It was used to set up Pemodalan Nasional Berhad, which partly was used to sort of decolonize the economy by taking the plantations back into Malaysian ownership, right?
Among other things.
Yes. So, these are very actually important lessons and institutions that are not necessarily present in a lot of Global South countries, right? So Malaysia actually has a lot to teach other countries, and it comes to mind that there are a couple of newly oil exporting countries like, say, Guyana, Senegal, right? They become major oil producers. But at a time when you've got climate change putting policy pressure on them. But they have this kind of window where they can convert that oil and gas wealth into lasting institutional financial capability and power to drive development there. And I think Malaysia has lessons there. And I think, there's investment opportunities that go along with that. Maybe Petronas can explore those kind of things and those kind of relationships. And certainly in terms of the downstream suppliers as well that we have here.
Therefore, it begs the question, does Malaysia have the competency, if not today, in the near future, to build these kind of industries resurging or to be in tandem with the resurgence of China back into global dominance, especially in the realm of private sector to make things more efficient, talent management, talent growth in order for us to keep up with our needs of the industry, as well as our utilization and leveraging of automation through artificial intelligence. Where do we stack when it comes to similar economies, maybe not the same but similar enough, small industries, small economies like Taiwan, who is good in one thing but damn good at it, Singapore, which is good in one thing but damn good at it, and South Korea, again, good in one thing but damn good at it. Do you feel that that is perhaps the recipe for success, and how does this come against the 3 elements that I spoke of earlier?
I think that recipe of success is not just being really good at just one or a few things, but also testing those capabilities that you have in the competitiveness of export markets, right? I mean, that's one of the lessons from industrial policy, is that if you just focus on the domestic market, 1, the scale limits you. 2, you may not get an honest signal about how great and how competitive your product is, right? But when you take it to the global market, then you're competing against firms from all over the world. And
that's the best signal, if not anything else.
And if you can survive that, that's how the Koreans made it, that's how the Japanese made it, that's how the Taiwanese made it, that's how the Chinese are making it now, right? And that's a lesson for us as well, Can we, go from like 0 to 60 or 0 to 80 straight away. No, but this is where the global south comes in, right? You can begin to compete export markets in slightly less intense competition environments, right? Say some African countries, Central Asia, and so forth, and then begin to scale up. There are countries in say Africa where European Union products, for example, are major competitors, right? And can we compete against them there? Because to get into European Union, it's still quite protectionist. They make it quite tough for us, right?
Yeah.
But to do it in a third country,
palm oil, for instance.
Yeah, to do it in a third country, and Africa is a major consumer of our palm oil. I think that's an interesting test of our firm capabilities. Right?
So, on top of departing in the American market, perhaps departing the EU market, perhaps is the next thing that we have to have on our agenda.
Yeah, I mean the EU hasn't made it easy, right? And
But isn't the purchasing power, the unit economics, the PPP, the GDP per capita of these markets far surpass all these markets that we speak of just now?
Well, the challenge with the EU is that they've had near stagnant growth for the last couple of years, right? And some would attribute that.
Some even declined to the UK.
So, and they have this kind of geographical split. You've got the eastern countries like Czech Republic and Hungary, which are zooming ahead, right? They're basically emerging markets in the European Union. And then you got your France and Germany, who have been a little bit more tepid, right? Of course, there's been renewed interest now that Germany has changed its fiscal policy, right? But
on balance, if you group it together as a collective.
Yeah, so it's not as dynamic as a consumption market, and they've been struggling with inflation shocks, from the Ukraine-Russia conflict as well as COVID and energy spikes. So their ability to consume goods also is not that great, right? Or it has its limits.
Yeah.
At the same time...
But when we talk about, say, the African market or Indonesia, for instance,
sky's
the limit.
There's big potential there,
and
right?
since it's a low base, any upside is still 10% increase is actually quite astronomical.
Yeah. And there's potential in Latin America as well. So I think it's good for our firms to explore these opportunities, and from what I hear from the stats being read out by the MITI minister, that's already happening. Take one example. A country like Rwanda, right? Very small country, right? And it's had a colorful history, but they tried to.
I only know of one thing in Rwanda, and that's not the great one that I should know of.
We know about the movie Hotel Rwanda.
Yes,
right?
of course, yeah.
But Rwanda has reinvented itself. They turned themselves into the tech hub of Africa. Right? And
I'm sorry, I didn't know that.
Yeah, they turned themselves into the tech hub of Africa. They have a very laissez-faire approach towards drone policy. Anybody who wants to do innovation in drones, you can just go there and put up the drones and experiment with them, right? Because they want to create that kind of environment. Then one of the entrepreneurs, he's like African of Indian origin, he said, why is Africa always exporting critical minerals to make mobile phones and not producing our own? So then he set up a project to do the Rwanda phone. It's like an Africa phone, and they managed to make the made in Africa smartphone, right? All locally sourced.
Of course, it's, and talk about supply chain, it's very short.
Yeah,
everything's mined there, sourced there.
Yeah, you just need to bring in the tech, all the chips and all this kind of stuff. So they pulled that off, right? In a way, they actually look at us because I think it's President or Prime Minister of Rwanda. He talks about wanting to be the Singapore of Africa. So they're looking at our part of the world for inspiration. So I think there are good opportunities and lessons there. We shouldn't take Africa for granted. It's not the same place as it was, say, 30 years ago. It's a very different place now.
Most of the folks I speak to on this show, I always ask about geopolitics. I'll spare you of that, but I want to ask you, what are you looking at for the next the 2 or 3 items that you're looking at, and rather closely looking at it, and why?
Well, one of the areas I'm looking at a lot now is our semiconductor industry and the potential for us to level up, right? And leveling up has often meant, finding a kind of deeper, more productive and mutually enriching relationship with our major trading partners on semiconductors. That's basically the US and China. It's made very complicated now in the last couple of months. But I think there's still a lot of potential in Malaysia as a sort of safe haven, very neutral place of production. But I think we have to begin to look at diversifying the markets for our semiconductor products. It won't be easy in the short term because the tariffs place a great deal of uncertainty. And President Trump has vowed to put some kind of measures on all semiconductor products, not just Malaysia, but everywhere else, in the coming months. We don't have visibility of what that will be, and understanding that is going to be quite important. I think also understanding the way in which global value chains can shift in Malaysia's favor of getting more value added done here is also quite important. And tied to that is developing our talent pool, developing our incentives for firms to do quality production in-house in Malaysia. That's a big challenge. So I would say semicon manufacturing, we want it. Every country wants to get better in manufacturing.
Especially the design part,
yeah,
the front end.
And a lot of countries are jumping on the semiconductor bandwagon. But I think the thing to recognize about Malaysia is that basically it's one of 11 countries that really has a serious semiconductor industry, and we've had one for 50 years.
But that also means that we are one in 11 countries chasing investment money to grow these kind of industries. It's pretty red ocean space unless we have that, I don't know, je ne sais quoi.
I think we've done better than, say, some emerging Gulf countries who they've thrown billions at it, right? And they've built sort of factories in the desert and so forth, but they've not really been able to build an industry precisely because they don't have the ecosystem that we have here in Malaysia. So I think we have to take that advantage and turn it into even more strategic use for our manufacturing future. Because, to be honest, I do understand where some of the US is coming from, because we've also deindustrialized, right, since the early 2000s. And the challenge that we have now is to reindustrialize. That's why we have the new industrial master plan and all the ambitions in there, right? We have no choice, because industrialization is the key, it's the secret sauce in order to get better wages, better jobs, right? Better research going on in our universities, and ultimately a better quality of life, right? These are the Malaysian goals. But we have to achieve them through the development of our own industry, our own large firms, and we got to export this kind of stuff, because the Malaysian market is just not big enough, right? So we need to have these good trade and diplomatic relationships with our neighbors, both near and far, in order to take advantage of that and build a better future for Malaysia.